My name is Katie Williams. I'm the Senior Manager for Education and Programs here at Pittock Mansion. I am brand new to this role. I was serving as an interim, pretty much in the same job since July. And also I was tasked with putting on Christmas 2021, which was really exciting. And so I'm excited to be in this role and to produce even more programs and educational opportunities for our audience members and for the general public too, and put on things like this that we can get people back in the door and just engaged and thinking about the mansion, and so that we're adding some enrichment to your lives and also to the city of Portland. So that's what we're here for. And also I want to take this time to acknowledge our members. If you are a member of the museum, you can type in chat, say I'm a member. You know, we always love to hear from our members. And it is membership that allows us to have programming like this and also to keep the mansion in a beautiful tip-top shape. So if you are not a member, I do encourage you to become a member of Pittock Mansion. And we happen to have, I won't put Maddie on the spot per se, but we do have a membership representative currently on staff with us tonight. But also if you are interested in membership, I can get that information to you pretty easily. It's on our website, of course. And Dana Manners is our development director who will be joining us this evening. So she can also answer questions about membership if you'd like. So let's see. So we are all here for the exhibit that we currently have that opened March 1st. It's called Thrill of the Climb, the Pittocks and Early Mountaineering in Oregon. So this is really exciting. Right now this is our virtual opening of this exhibit. Because we're, you know, in the times that we decided to make a virtual program. But the cool thing is that, like, as you can see, we have people from out of state and out of the country, thank you very much, who are able to attend. So going forward, I'd love to see programs like this where we can have people in, but also reach people further outside of our walls. So the exhibit opened March 1st. It runs through July 3rd. Also, I do have some housekeeping bits here. So I want to remind you that this program is being recorded. However, the cameras are off except for presenters, so you can sit back and relax and not have to worry about, you know, what the hair looks like or what's happening on your screen. So that's just a feature of webinar there. This presentation is going to run about an hour, and we will have time in that hour for Q&A. And this is, like I said, it's being hosted on webinar, and so this is our first webinar. I'm very familiar with Zoom meetings, as I'm sure we all are by this point, but Zoom webinar is a new platform for me and for us at Pittock Mansion. So if there is a snafu that arises, please be patient and we will get back online shortly. And if there are questions throughout the presentation, you're welcome to type them into the Q&A feature down at the bottom of your screen, and we'll relay them to Matthew after the talk. And Jennifer will be moderating that discussion. So on that note, I'd like to introduce Jennifer Fang, our Pittock Mansion Director of Interpretation and Community Engagement, and my supervisor. Thank you, Jennifer. And the curator for this exhibit. She has just a few remarks, and then Mathew Brock from Mazamas will present. And Jennifer, with that, I will pass it to you.
Thank you so much, Katie. And thank you all for joining us tonight, this evening via Zoom. We are absolutely thrilled to be, holding programs again. We are thrilled to have this new exhibit open, and we are absolutely thrilled to have Mathew Brock here with us tonight. Mathew is the Library and Historical Collections Manager at the Mazamas, which is based in Portland. And as Katie mentioned, tonight's program is in conjunction with the opening of our new exhibit, which is called The Thrill of the Climb, the Pittocks and Early Mountaineering in Oregon. This exhibit is about the development of mountaineering as an organized sport and as a form of recreation in the late 1800s, and the Pittock family's involvement in the sport. Henry Pittock and his daughters, Kate and Lucy Pittock, were all mountain climbers, and they were active in the local mountaineering community. And this exhibit that we have on view at Pittock right now was created in partnership with the Mazamas. all of the objects that are on display, as well as many of the photographs that are exhibited, were borrowed from the Mazamas historical collection. And so, when visitors come, they can see, they can learn about, but also see the stuff that people used to climb mountains back in the early days. And it is pretty incredible to see, just what outdoor gear looked like back then. The exhibit is on view until July 3rd. We encourage everybody to visit Pittock Mansion, not only to see the show, but also to check out some of the changes and updates that we've been making around the museum. Admission to the museum is free for Pittock Mansion members. For non-members, it's $12 for adults, $10 for seniors, $8 for youth, and free for children under 6. And with that, I will hand it over to Mathew Brock. Mathew, are you ready?
I am. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here. As Kate and Jennifer both mentioned, my name is Mathew Brock, and for the last 7 years, I've had the pleasure of being the Library and Historical Collections Manager for the Mazamas. Tonight, I invite you to join me as we look back at the climbing history of Henry Pittock and the formation of the Mazamas and the early history of mountaineering in the Pacific Northwest. Before we begin, I'd like to once again thank Kate and Jennifer and all of the staff at the Pittock Mansion for the chance not only to speak with you all this evening, but also for the amazing opportunity to collaborate with them on their new exhibit, The Thrill of the Climb. It's been a wonderful collaborative experience, and I honestly, I haven't been up to see the exhibit, but I know what's in it, and I'm very excited to get up there. I'm also indebted and want to thank a couple of other people, Eric Weisenberg, KF Stewart, Jack Grauer, and the numerous other authors and researchers who provided the source material for tonight's presentation. And then lastly, I'd like to thank all of the members of the Mazamas. I see a few of you in the participant list, as well as all of the members of the Pittock Mansion. It's with your support that we are able to do the work that we do, and we greatly appreciate it. So with that, I think we will get started. The mountains of the Cascades, especially St. Helens, Adams, and Hood, pulled the early adventurers out of the growing metropolitan areas and into the wilderness. In the summer of 1853, Thomas Dreyer and a number of other men stood on the summit of Mount St. Helens. During the early exploration and settlement of the Oregon Territory, very few had the time or the energy to climb mountains. However, a handful of individuals like Dreyer were drawn to the mountains. His climb of Mount St. Helens marked the beginning of the golden age of mountain climbing in the Pacific Northwest. A year later, in 1854, Dreyer climbed Mount Hood. His claim of having reached the summit was challenged by his eager young employee, Henry Pittock. Pittock, like many of the early Portland businessmen, appears cold and calculating in his dark Victorian-era suit with a stern expression devoid of humor. But his public image was at odds with his passion for life and outdoor activities. Henry was born in London, England, on March 1st, 1836, and grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania with his family. As a boy, he learned printing in his family's printing firm and studied at Western University of Pennsylvania's preparatory school. He arrived in Oregon in 1853 at the age of 17 after making the crossing on the Oregon Trail by covered wagon. Soon after, he was hired by Thomas Dreyer and went to work at the Weekly Oregonian, one of the many newspapers in Portland at the time. He worked as a printer, handled distribution, and soon rose through the ranks to shop foreman. In lieu of wages, Pittock, as a business manager, was made a partner in 1854. On August 6, 1857, Pittock, along with 4 others, L. J. Powell, William Buckley, Linman Chittenden, and James Deardorff, made what is considered the first documented climb of Mount Hood. Like Dreyer 3 years earlier, Pittock and his party left from Philip Foster Farm in Clackamas County and made their way to the summit over 5.5 hours, reaching the top at around 12:30 p.m. After lunch, they planted an alpenstock in the snow with a handkerchief, which they left blowing in the north wind. Pittock, who was 23 years old at the time, and the other quote-unquote boys, then amused themselves for an hour by rolling rocks off the summit and watching them crash into the outcroppings below. Pittock also recalled descending into one of the sulfur-spewing vents about 30 feet on a rope and not being able to see the bottom. The snow on Hood that day was perfect for glissading, and the party was off the mountain in just over 2 hours. After making their way back to Portland, James Deardorff, a member of Pittock's party, published an account of their climb in the Democratic Standard, a rival publication to Dreyer's Weekly Oregonian. In his article, Deardorff gave his opinion, and it can be assumed one shared by Pittock and the other two climbers, that Dreyer's party had stopped some 300 feet shy of the summit back in 1854. What they found there differed in appearance from Dreyer's published account. Dreyer reported finding a summit ridge running from southwest to north that was pockmarked by vents emitting sulfurous gas. Pittock's party found a summit ridge that ran west to east and no evidence of smoking vents, although they could see from the summit a scene that matched Dreyer's description some 300 feet lower on the mountain slope. Needless to say, Dreyer was less than pleased with Deardorff's assertion and published a lengthy response in the next edition of his own paper. Over the next several weeks, arguments volleyed back and forth in Portland's newspapers. In his detailed assessment of the early years of the Mazamas, Eric Weiselberg notes that, quote, Dreyer sought to shift the terms of the argument and to argue on the basis of respect, age, and gentlemanly behavior, rather than on credibility and accuracy of reporting. As K.F. Stewart notes in their biography of Pittock, I kept at work, quote, what Dreyer and Pittock said to each other while working together over the Oregonian presses went unrecorded, but they did continue their joint labor for 3 more years. Pittock returned to climb Hood again in 1854 with a larger group that included 2 members of the 57 party. Pittock's own recounting of that year's climb notes that the trek up from Crater Rock was much more difficult than it had been the previous year. The party was forced to cut steps into the hard snow with the iron tips of their alpenstocks. Using a telescope, they could see smoke from an Oregon City foundry, the windows of a Portland church reflecting the sun, the prairies of Central Oregon, and the peaks of St. Helens, Adams, and even as far as Rainier. Planted on the summit was a 6-foot American flag left from a previous party who had summited on July 4th. Pittock and his party gathered around the flag, gave 3 cheers, fired off a pistol, and let off a few firecrackers. In an era before widespread adoption of sunglasses, snow blindness was a real concern, and the party was slowed on their descent due to everyone's sunburned faces and eyes. Pittock's 1859 climb turned out to be the most dangerous yet. The top 300 feet below the summit were almost bare of snow, and the party was forced to pick their way over loose stones and gravel. Every few steps, someone would kick loose a stone that went rolling past everyone below them. On the way up, they noticed the tracks of a wolf, which they followed all the way to the summit, where the tracks passed over and descended the other side. Upon reaching the summit, they found that it was covered with butterflies, some of which they captured and brought back as specimens. Also on the summit, they found a bottle containing the names of another party from a week prior and the remains of the firecrackers that they had lit off a year before. However, no sign of the flag or its pole. In what might be an indication of the relationship between Pittock and Dreyer, it's interesting to note that Pittock's longtime friend, George T. Meyer, climbed Hood twice that year. Once with Dreyer in July of 1859, and then again with Pittock a month later. Meyer became the first person known to have climbed Mount Hood twice in the same season. After scaling Mount Hood each year for 3 consecutive years, Henry took a decades-long break from climbing. In 1860, he married Georgiana Burton and assumed ownership of the Oregonian newspaper outright. We can assume that he shifted his focus from growing his family and building the Oregonian, now a daily, into a successful business. Henry would return to mountaineering in the 1880s, this time bringing along his daughters, Kate and Lucy Pittock. As adults, Kate and Lucy embraced their father's love of hiking and climbing. The sisters both joined the Mazamas in 1895 after climbing Mount Hood that year. Lucy also climbed Mount McLaughlin, then known as Mount Pitt, along with her father in 1896, and summited Pinnacle Peak in 1897 during their outing to Mount Rainier. As the number of Portland area climbing enthusiasts grew, so did the movement to create a group of like-minded individuals for them to join. Following a national trend for the formation of social and civic clubs, in September of 1887, William Steele was one of a group of Portland climbers who led the effort to establish the Oregon Alpine Club, the first mountaineering group west of the Continental Divide. While we don't know for certainty when Pittock and Steele first met, it's likely they came in contact with each other through their involvement with the Oregon Alpine Club. Pittock, his son-in-law Frederick Ledbetter, and friend George Meyer were all members. While mountaineering was an early focus, climbing soon gave way to elevator riding and telescope climbers who spent more time viewing Mount Hood from downtown Portland office buildings. The Oregon Alpine Club reached its pinnacle of glory in May of 1888 when it hosted a talk by noted author Charles Dickens. Over its few short years of existence, membership had been extended to, among others, the Oregon Camera Club, canoeists, civic boosters, and tourism promoters. In 1888, Steele assisted in a reorganization of the Alpine Club to try and regain its alpine focus. However, his efforts were for naught, and by late 1892, the Oregon Alpine Club had declared bankruptcy. This, even after Steele had gone so far as to sink $1,000 of his own money into the organization. It's through the efforts of William Gladstone Steele, pictured here on the left, that really influences the next part of the story I'll share with you tonight. Steele was born in 1854 in Ohio and lived in Kansas before moving to Portland, Oregon in 1872. While in Kansas, sometime around 1870, he first read about Crater Lake, supposedly in a newspaper wrapped around his lunch. That article about a lake hidden in the caldera of an extinct volcano would come to dominate his life and influence much of what he accomplished. After finishing high school, Steele tried his hand at several different occupations, including newspaper publishing, railroad promotion, and real estate development, among others, before eventually becoming superintendent of the U.S. Postal Service and overseeing all the mail carriers in Portland. A few years after moving to the Northwest, Steele became interested in mountaineering. In the picture on the right, Steele stands in the center, leg propped on the curb, in front of his real estate development office, sometime around 1891. In 1885, Steele realizes his long-held dream of visiting Crater Lake for the first time. While he is there, he helps name many of the features and leaves in awe of the lake's majestic beauty. He returns to Portland, determined to do all he can to preserve it. He gets right to work and pushes for legislation barring the proposed development of 10 town sites around Crater Lake. In 1886, he helps organize a U.S. Geological Survey expedition to map and measure the lake's depth. In early 1894, Steele and a handful of former Oregon Alpine Club members quietly start meeting to draft a constitution, select a name, and pick a slate of officers for a new organization. Steele's dream of a great mountaineering club comprised of real mountaineers was to be inaugurated atop Mount Hood, and it was decided that climbing a glaciated peak would be a requirement for membership. In March of 1894, they launched their new endeavor with ads in newspapers around the West. Pittock played a large part in the build-up to the establishment of the Mazamas. For the previous 30 years, the Oregonian printed little on Mount Hood, as any further climbs were no longer firsts. As Stewart notes in their book, one notable exception occurs in 1874, when a party came back from the summit with Pittock's alpenstock, made from a sapling he had cut at Timberline on his first climb in 1857, in which, you will recall, he left on the summit, planted as a flag. The alpenstock was inscribed with Pittock's name and the date of the climb. He kept it proudly in his office until the Willamette River flooded in 1894, when it was lost, presumably floating down the river and out to sea. For 11 days prior and 9 days after the selected date of the inauguration of the Mazamas, the Oregonian ran 9 separate articles about the ascent. On the appointed day, over 350 people from all walks of life assembled in the small hamlet of Government Camp, some of them having traveled 3 or more days by horseback or buggy over rudimentary roads, where they met up and set up an army of tents at the foot of Mount Hood. In this photo from Base Camp, Henry Pittock can be seen standing proudly in the center. Noted Mazama historian John Scott wrote, quote, "Despite a formidable thunder and sleet storm, which turned back 100 would-be climbers, 155 men and 38 women gained the summit on Thursday, July 19th, 1894. The piercing wind soon forced most of these to go below the sleet zone, but 40-odd hardy souls remained to formally organize the club and elect Will Steele president. Later, 105 climbers signed up as charter members, and thus from the ashes of the now defunct Oregon Alpine Club was born the Mazamas. Pittock and his two daughters were among those that were turned back due to weather. Pittock was a risk taker. He wouldn't have reached the summit of Mount Hood or the Portland business establishment without being one, but he was not rash. The safety of his daughters and others came first. And while their names were not listed as those on the summit, Henry Pittock was granted charter member status in the Mazamas in recognition of his 1857 first ascent. The photo on the left is the group of climbers reaching the summit of Mount Hood via the Cooper Spur route during the inaugural climb. On the right is a photo collage showing the newly elected officers of the Mazamas. It should be noted that the first two vice presidents of the organization were women, and that female mountaineers have consistently made up between 1/4 and 1/3 of the membership since the organization's inception. According to Martin Gorman, writing in 1896, the mountain goat was chosen as the mascot for the Mazamas due to the animal's mountain climbing sure-footedness. In addition, university linguists from both the East and West Coast were consulted, and they confirmed that the word Mazama was the genus name for mountain goats, antelope, and American deer. The official badge, adopted at the organization's second meeting in March of 1894, is described as, quote, consisting of a circle enclosing a triangle with a dot in the center, with the erect head of a Mazama resting on a scroll bearing the name Mazama surmounting the whole. The triangle with a dot in the center was the conventional symbol used for mountains by the United States Coast and Geodetic Survey. The blue in the background represents the sky, while the white, the alpine snow. The Mazama motto, which out of respect for the Chinook Indians, I will not attempt to say, loosely translates to "We climb high." The logo has remained relatively unchanged and proudly continues to represent the organization to this day. Excuse me. The Mazamas of the 1890s were explorers. The January 28, 1896 Oregonian quotes Steele talking about the ambitious scope of projects in store for the Mazamas. Quote, "The mountains of Washington and Oregon are now unapproachable to tourists. There is no botany of Cascade flora, no maps, nor even altitudes of important peaks. All of this is work for Mazamas." To paraphrase the original charter, the Mazamas set for themselves 4 goals. 1, the exploration of snow-capped peaks and other mountains. 2, to collect scientific knowledge about the mountain environment. 3, to preserve the natural beauty of the forests and mountains. And 4, to share all of that knowledge around the Pacific Northwest. An early Mazama stood a better than even chance of persevering and summiting a mountain. That was the good news. The bad news? They had to endure days of dogged travel just to reach base camp, climbing in what amounted to old clothes and sleeping in improvised sleeping bags made from 2 heavy woolen blankets held together with safety pins. For sustenance, early climbers often relied on oatmeal, prunes, canned beans, bacon, toast, jam, and coffee to fuel them up the trail. When it came to climbing, groups could number upwards of 100 individuals, following the leader and being herded up the trail by an individual known as the rear guard. Rope was often just clothesline, crampons were unheard of, and ice axes were a curiosity. More commonly used were handmade alpenstocks, often crafted from the handles of old farm tools and nails. Early instructions to prospective climbers were simple. Wear heavy hobnailed boots with 2 pairs of woolen socks, bring an extra warm, wind and waterproof coat, an alpenstock, and never forget your 4 Gs, gloves, goggles, grease paint, and grub. By the way, the grease paint was used to ward off high altitude sunburn. This nasty concoction was mostly a mixture of lamp black and Vaseline. As John Scott noted, it was no trick to put on, but required a Turkish bath and sandpaper to get off. At their first meeting, the Mazamas nominated and elected John Muir, the first honorary member of the Mazamas. Muir was a fitting choice for several reasons. He was the type of person many Mazamas strove to be, and he shared a kindred spirit for the preservation of natural wonders. In an article for the 1915 Mazama Annual, written a year after his death, Muir is described as a scientist, writer, explorer, nature lover, and poet. We know now that he was all of those things and more. The Mazamas saw in Muir an individual who embodied the persona that many of them strove to become. Muir was also honored because of his work to establish Yosemite as a national park, paralleled the 14 years effort by William Steele to establish Crater Lake National Park. Steele and Muir met for the first time in 1888 on an early climb of Mount Rainier, and although the two were only acquaintances, they had common interests and would exchange correspondence for years to come. Their efforts to preserve Crater Lake and Yosemite would parallel and overlap. Both men received early local support, and their campaigns were endorsed by their state's major newspapers. They both gave public lectures to promote their causes, aided by the fact that each was a known climber and an advocate for the scientific study of the mountain environment. In May of 1902, Steele's efforts and lobbying paid off when President Roosevelt signed the bill establishing Crater Lake National Park. As the park's second superintendent, Steele helped develop the Crater Lake Lodge and Rim Drive. In 1895, the year following the inauguration of the Mazamas, Pittock's daughters, Kate and Lucy, along with their brother-in-law, Frederick Ledbetter, and Pittock's sister, Harriet's son, H.D. Sutton, made their own climb of Mount Hood and became members of the organization. Lucy accompanied her father on the 1896 Mazama outing to Crater Lake that year. On August 16th, they were among the 32 people who ascended Mount Pitt. In this photograph of 11 female mountain climbers, likely taken at the summit of Mount McLaughlin during the Mazama Crater Lake outing, Lucy Pittock can be seen standing proudly in the center, wearing a white blouse and holding an alpenstock. Bertha Ledbetter Pittock, her sister-in-law, is to the right, wearing the white sunbonnet. In 1897, the members of the Mazamas elected Henry Pittock president of the organization. The minutes from Pittock's year as president show that he appointed a committee to search for additional space to store publications, books, and curios. He and the Executive Council urged the U.S. Geographic Survey to map the state of Oregon and Mount Hood specifically. He signed on to a petition to create the Olympic Mountains Forest Reserve and urged the creation of Crater Lake National Park. In the early years of the Mazamas, the annual outing was the big social event of the season, and under Pittock's tenure, the location chosen for the 1897 was Mount Rainier. Given the difficulty and time required, to say nothing of the logistics of reaching the mountains in the 1800s, these outings were no small affairs. They often involved upwards of 100 people or more, traveling by boat, train, wagon, and on horseback over several days just to reach the site of base camp. In addition to climbers, there were cooks and camp porters and wagon loads of supplies that were needed to support a huge party, sometimes for weeks in the wilderness. The outing to Mount Rainier generated nationwide interest in the Pacific Northwest, its mountains, and contributed substantially to the creation of Mount Rainier National Park a year and a half later in 1899. In addition to the over 40 Mazamas, a contingent of climbers from California's Sierra Club, the Appalachian Mountain Club, and many eminent scientists were represented. In addition to William Steele and Henry Pittock, other notable members of the outing included the first vice president of the Mazamas and the first woman to ever climb Mount Rainier, Miss Fay Fuller, Dr. E.W. Young, and Edward Curtis of Seattle. Edward Curtis would go on to become renowned around the world for his ethnographic work among and portraits of the Native Americans of the Western United States. Even though there were other experienced climbers on the trip, Steele, Pittock, and Fuller among them, Curtis was selected as the climb leader on the Rainier outing due to his having spent considerable time on the mountain, climbing and photographing its many changing seasons. Prior to the climb, Curtis is said to have remarked to a friend, quote, excuse me, to a friend, quote, "It will be a grand trip, but there are too many inexperienced people in the party. I fear that before we return, some accident will happen which will bathe the trip in gloom. Here we see a view of the Mazama base camp taken by Curtis. It gives a good impression of what camp life was like in the late 1800s. In the picture, you can see a mess hall in the back and sleeping tents. Everything you see here, including the tents and the cast iron stoves, would have been hauled in by pack horses. Henry Pittock, second from the left, can be seen standing next to a woman who might have been one of his daughters. Like today, mountaineers often made preliminary climbs of nearby peaks to build stamina for the principal climb. The Rainier outing was no exception. In this photograph, we see members of the climbing party on the summit of Pinnacle Peak. Henry Pittock is seated in the center, in the bottom of the notch. Edward Curtis is seated on the lower right with a white kerchief around his neck and camera resting in his lap. Seated between them is Ella McBride in the jaunty black hat. An amateur photographer at the time, she would go on to earn national fame as a still life photographer in her own right. Pittock was one of the climb leaders who led the two-day climb to Rainier's 14,528-foot summit. They reached the summit at 3:30 in the afternoon, although some of the party, including Lucy, turned back due to altitude sickness. Pittock was 63 years old at the time of his Rainier climb. Of the 75 climbers who started out, 59 made the summit, a remarkable record for what in modern times we would consider amateurs. As Curtis had feared before the outing began, the death of Professor Edward McClure of the University of Oregon, who fell on the descent, put a terrible damper on what was otherwise a successful climb and gathering. Curtis recreated the rescue of another climber, as seen in this image. An interesting footnote to Pittock's time as Mazama president was his approval of a project proposed by William Steele to fly huge kites from the summit of Mount Rainier. Steele envisioned kites large enough to carry 50 pounds of scientific equipment up to a mile above the summit. From that altitude, they were to gather scientific data and take photographs of the summit and beyond. Steele went so far as to travel to the East Coast to meet with preeminent kite manufacturers and flyers. He purchased kites and even learned the skills needed to craft his own. On the day of the climb, only one of the 6 kites made it to the summit, the other 5 having been left at various places along the way because they were heavy and cumbersome to carry. On the summit, unfortunately, the sole remaining kite was too damaged to fly in the high winds and had to be abandoned. At the annual meeting in October of 1897, Pittock lost his bid for re-election to the presidency of the Mazamas on a vote of 17-2. His defeat, however, didn't dampen his enthusiasm, thankfully. On July 21st, 1898, Henry and Lucy celebrated with the Mazamas atop Mount St. Helens during that year's annual outing. The following year, 1899, saw the Pittocks and the Mazamas travel north to Lake Chelan in Washington State for that year's annual outing. In the reporting of the outing, it's noted that Henry and Georgiana Pittock arrived, quote, just a little too late for the climb of Mount Sahalee, unquote. The presence of Georgiana was more than likely an indication that Henry had no intention of climbing that year, and it's more than likely that his 1898 climb of Mount St. Helens marked the end of his climbing career. In this image, taken by Edward Curtis on the St. Helens outing, Lucy and Henry are 3rd and 4th, respectively, from the right. Pittock has his hand on the brim of his hat. In 1901, Pittock traveled south with a Mazama contingent that included Rodney Glisson and others to join the Sierra Club's outing to the High Sierra. In his photo album from the trip, Glisson included this image of 67-year-old Pittock sitting in the shade with John Muir. It's unknown the level of activity Pittock engaged in during the Sierra Club outing. Pittock makes one last appearance at the base camp for the 1912 Mazama climb of Mount Hood. He can be seen in both photographs and in some rare film footage, milling around with other climbers in front of Cloudcap Inn. This likely marks the end of his outings and involvements with the Mazamas. He would have been 76 years old and at an age when time weighed more heavily on an individual than it does now. Henry Pittock's death in 1919 corresponded with the end of the golden age of mountaineering in the Northwest. He not only led by example, but also had a profound impact on the development of mountaineering in the Pacific Northwest. He, along with William Steele and the other founders of the Mazamas, worked to promote mountaineering through word and deed. To paraphrase Eric Weisenberg, they were part of a modernizing American culture which emerged after the Civil War and whose scientific, nationalistic, reformist, and professional proclivities praised exploring, record-keeping, record-setting, publishing, and promoting. Their efforts acted as part of a process that made good citizens out of pioneers. With nationalism and public service in mind, they promoted themselves and their environment as they climbed mountains around the Northwest. What began as William Steele's dream of a new mountaineering club with 105 members on the summit of Mount Hood has grown over the past 127 years into an organization of 2,500 members strong. Currently, the Mazamas lead hundreds of hikes and climbs a year. They provide educational opportunities across a wide variety of areas and are active in funding scientific investigations and conservation activities. I hope you have enjoyed this short journey through our history as much as I have enjoyed sharing it with you. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Matthew. That was wonderful. And so interesting. I've never seen the photo of Henry Pittock with John Muir before. It's just, yeah, very cool. So I would like to remind folks, if anyone has any questions, to please type the question into either the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen, or also you can also type it into chat. We'll be monitoring both. We did get one question during your talk, Matthew, that you sort of addressed, but maybe you can talk about it at greater length. The question is, how much does an alpenstock weigh, and what kind of wood was generally used?
Yeah. So if you go out into your garage and grab a shovel or a hoe or a rake from your yard supplies, that's basically what an alpenstock is. We have probably 4 dozen alpenstocks in our collection, and I would say the vast majority of them are repurposed farm tools. And yeah, they weigh just about what your average rake would weigh. And then in terms of the wood, the vast majority of them, I think, are made of oak. They're very sturdy, very strong. Some of them are 120 years old, 130 years old now, and they have held up very well.
Thank you. Looks like we do have one more question that came in, actually, that so the person's asking, yes, it is possible to get a copy of the recorded presentation. We have recorded the presentation, and we will be posting the recording as soon as it's ready to our website. And we can also email the registrants with the link to the presentation as soon as it's done. Barbara Brady has also made the comment, or actually it's a question. She wants to know, Matthew, has the topography of Mount Hood changed a lot over the years? The top didn't look like that when I climbed it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably safe to assume that it has changed. And then it's going to look different from year to year based on the snow load and wind and drifts and, how much activity has been up there. I think the point that Dreyer and Deerdorf were making was that, Dreyer was claiming to have reached the top, and it didn't look anything like what he had said when they got up there. The summit ridge being, at opposing angles to each other is a pretty good indication that he didn't make it all the way to the top. But I think, I think it's fair to say that the topography changes, over the years and with wind and snow and that kind of stuff.
Thank you. Another question for you is, did any of the climbers ever keep a diary of their quest?
That's a good question. we have one account, a handwritten account of the inaugural climb of the Mazamas, written by Frank Branch Riley, which is probably the closest thing we have to a diary of the climb. In our collection at the Mazama Library and Historical Collections, most of the diaries we have are from major expeditions. So if they set off to climb Mount McKinley and it was, 3 weeks to a month, we have those. But in terms of diaries of specific climbs, I can only think of a couple. Yeah, I don't think it was a very common thing. Oftentimes people would write up, maybe they would send a letter to their family or something and we would get that. But yeah, I don't know if that exactly answers the question.
I'll just chime in here to say too that the illustrated account of that inaugural climb of Mount Hood by Frank Branch Riley is one of the objects loaned to Pittock Mansion by the Mazamas and is on display. The cover and the back cover of this this work is on display in the exhibit. And yeah, it is I read through it before I put it up, and it's a very neat firsthand account of what happened, and also very cool that the person was, I think, he was 18 years old when he made this this document. It's very neat.
Yeah.
We have one question here that Matthew, maybe you and I can talk about. So the question is, I'm interested in what objects have been included in the exhibition, anything of Pittock's own. And I mean, I can just say so there are many photographs in the exhibit, that some of which, Matthew showed in the PowerPoint, that are images of the Pittock, of Henry Pittock and his daughters on these exhibitions or on these expeditions. And they are, they're technically like these images belong to both Pittock Mansion and the Mazamas, but they are not like, things that the Pittocks owned necessarily. But other than that, no other objects that were owned by Henry Pittock have been displayed, but most other pieces are of the time period in which the Pittocks were climbing mountains. And those objects primarily belong to the Mazamas.
Yeah, I would completely support that. Unfortunately, as Katie and Jennifer and I have talked about in numerous times in developing this exhibit, there is very little that exists from that era of climbing, unfortunately. The things that do exist are the alpenstocks, the very early ice axes, the things that were very, very durable. There's nothing, very little clothing exists at all. There's only one piece that I know of that is still in existence from that era, which is unfortunate and sad. But we are, what is great is we have a very rich photographic history of that era in which we can see the things that were used, but very few actual objects exist from that era, unfortunately.
I was also surprised to see what appeared to me to be kind of like how improvised a lot of the equipment was, or it was, equipment that had been like repurposed from other, like the tool handles for the alpenstocks. It was just, it's very interesting, now when we're living in an age of, outdoor equipment is an industry. But back then, before the like advent of Gore-Tex, it was just a very different story for people wanting to climb mountains.
Yeah.
We have one question here from Caroline, who says that she's pleasantly surprised to see women members, and asks, was this controversial at the time?
Oh, that's a great question. Was it controversial? not necessarily. It was unique that the Mazamas, that's one of the things that I think is very unique about the Mazamas, is that from the very beginning, from July 19th of 1894, women were accepted as full-fledged members with full standing, the same standing as men in the organization. There was no women's auxiliary, there was no wives club, there was no second-class status for them. They were equals. And you see that on the front cover of the 1900 Mazama Annual, where there are depictions of a man and a woman in full climbing gear, and a pretty progressive representation. The woman is wearing pants. So that was very forward thinking. They were pretty progressive in that sense. Now, that's not to say that the gender roles were equal. The Mazamas didn't get their first female climb leader until 1914, I think. Women still tended to fulfill the same roles in camp and in town that they did at home. But they were allowed on the climbs, they were allowed on committees, they could vote the same, they could make decisions, they could take leadership roles. And so that I think was pretty progressive. And when we look at the membership data over the last 127 years, it breaks down to be about a third or a quarter female membership consistently over time. It ebbs and flows ever so slightly, but the average seems to be about the same.
Really interesting. Caroline also notes that the women should get double credit for climbing in those outfits.
Absolutely.
Which I think we all agree here.
Yeah. As a side note, one of the things that I have enjoyed watching is the evolution of the dress, women's dress, from the very beginning up through until I think it's in the late 1920s, when there was a pretty scandalous at the time. The Mazamas ran a hike where women wore shorts, and that raised quite a few eyebrows. But to see them go from petticoats and slips and these full dresses over the course of about 40 years to climbing in what bloomers and shorts that's pretty amazing.
We have another question here asking, do you know how much an average trip would cost for having a base camp stationed at the bottom of the mountain?
I don't know. Membership early on was, there was an initiation fee of $1, and membership was 50 cents a year. And then it goes up to $3 initiation and $1 a year. I think the outings, I want to say early on, were probably $5 or $7, but you have to keep that in the context that $1 then went a lot further than it does now. What is interesting is that everybody paid the same rate. So Pittock, who was this captain of industry and incredibly wealthy, paid the same price as the butcher from the grocery store down the street. So in that sense, it was very egalitarian. But I don't know a specific cost for the outing. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Another question, is Mount Hood now usually climbed in July and August?
The climbing season on Hood has gotten significantly smaller and shorter. Early on, the summit registers show year-round climbing. They would climb up from January all the way through to December, depending on the weather, really. But it has definitely gotten shorter. The last probably couple of decades, the Mazama climbing calendar would start in May and would run through July or August. I think it's getting a little bit shorter now with climate change and the decrease in the snow cap and those factors. Yeah, it definitely is shrinking. I can say that for sure.
Thank you. We had a question pop up in chat that asks, do you still have to climb Mount Hood to join the Mazamas?
No, you do not have to climb Mount Hood specifically to join the Mazamas. You do still have to climb a glaciated peak, and that is defined as a mountain with a living glacier.
Still a requirement.
Still a requirement. Yes.
Very rigid.
There was a bylaws amendment that failed to achieve the 2/3 majority last October to get rid of it. But I will prophesize that question will be coming back before the membership in not too long, because we're running out of glaciers.
Oh gosh. We have one more question here. Matthew, so you'd mentioned Lucy needing to descend with alpine sickness. Are there other stories related to health and safety around climbing Mount Hood and the other peaks?
Yeah, and a lot of it stems, some of the earliest ones, in researching for this presentation, I was looking back at the earliest reporting on Pittocks climb. And there was one particular guy, and his name escapes me, that wrote several articles in the newspaper purporting that if you got above a certain elevation, and I think it was something like 7,000 or 8,000 feet, that your eyes would bleed and that blood would run from your ears and that you would be unable to breathe. And so there was this stigma early on about going too high up mountains and that would cause you health issues. Well, we obviously know now that, you really only get health issues at super high elevations. You spend too long on the summit of Everest and you're going to have problems. That doesn't mean that people don't do it without oxygen, but it's not healthy. But everyone, there's the summit registers have all sorts of references to people feeling lightheaded or having to turn around. Pittock, that was one of the things that, his daughters were on the climb, and he was a leader by example, and he turned around because they were not feeling well on the inaugural climb of Mount Hood, as well as the weather. The weather affects that too. You can get hypothermia and exposure, and as well as the sun blindness that affected him on several of his climbs, particularly on Hood. So it's very common, and it was very well known at the time.
Thank you. One question just came in. I think if we probably have time for one or two more questions. So here's one for you, Matthew. It's actually more of a comment. There are still enough glaciers for people to climb. I hope they don't change the bylaws. The Mazamas have such a good history and such pride in their accomplishments. Let's see. I think that probably wraps it up. And we can give a few seconds longer for last questions to roll in. Otherwise, thank you all so much for attending tonight's event. I think this probably about wraps it up. And thank you, Matthew, so much for sharing this. It's really interesting history with us tonight. And thank you all for attending. I just want to put in one last plug to visit Pittock Mansion to see the Thrill of the Climb exhibit. It's on view through July 3rd. And have a great night, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.